I love games, if you can't tell from most of the videos on my YouTube channel. It's cool when you are able to immerse yourself in a world and really get to know a character as you follow them along a set path, or when you make your own character and use the world and its systems to create your own adventure and story. It's cool to lose yourself in that experience. And every year it seems like it's easier and easier to lose yourself in that experience as graphics and the world of video games becomes larger and more lifelike. Every year it seems that we push an envelope that is always on the verge of bursting. But when I look back at older games that I grew up on, I find myself remembering their distinct art styles as opposed to games that have chased the more realistic graphics achievable for the era. I don't think it's a controversial opinion to say that oftentimes people will take a game that might look technically less lifelike if that means it can be a more recognizable art style, more streamlined levels, and maybe even come out a little sooner than it might have otherwise. So why do most AAA games go for this approach? How did we get here, and what can they learn from smaller budget experiences? So, how did we get here? I mean, games didn't always look like this. They used to look like this, and people were just dreaming of a day when they could do something like this. Well, that day would come and go, and the console manufacturers as well as the big name developers kept chasing more and more lifelike worlds. I'm oversimplifying here, but to me the answer is pretty simple. The easiest way to get a leg up on the competition, as well as a clear visual way to show to the consumer that your Xbox or PlayStation or Sega Dreamcast could do more than anything else, is to visually prove it with the most cutting edge graphics available. That's how we got tech demos like the PlayStation Dinosaur or Link and Ganon Fight demo that came out right before Wind Waker. These are easy ways to show off that this new console generation is the one where they can finally make anything, and their new console is the platform that will run these new graphical enhancements. These tech demos and graphical enhancements as a whole are essentially a promise that the future is now, and you can leave all those limitations and other garbage in the past. But the problem is that garbage and limits breeds creativity and personality. There's a reason I point out the Dinosaur demo and Zelda demo as opposed to something more new. They may have been cutting edge for the time, but they still certainly had limitations. And what makes them more memorable to me than any graphics or technical showcase that we see today is the fact that these new things may look flashy, but I'm not really going to be thinking about how many pores and light particles a console is able to push nowadays. It just doesn't excite the way it used to. Now I'm glossing over a bunch of stuff, a ton of history, probably enough details to make a whole nother YouTube video about, but I think you get the point. Graphics have been something that have been getting more and more lifelike pretty much every year since video games became a thing. It allows for more stories to be told and larger worlds to be made, but things can't keep getting more and more lifelike and just bigger and bigger. Eventually you're at a limit and those advantages can start to look a lot more like roadblocks in my eyes. So all that history is great, but how good can something look before a realistic game experience doesn't really excite people anymore? What happens then? Well, I think that we're sort of seeing that play out right now. We've been coasting on a plateau for a while now. In the last decade or so, we've seen games get bigger in three key ways: the size of the map, the overall detail of characters and other elements within the game, and the actual size that the game takes up on your hard drive. Those things are all impressive at first and can still be if the story or mechanics back these things up, but eventually you start to see diminishing returns in terms of consumer interest, in my opinion. Sure, there are still people that buy these overloaded games, and there are still lifelike games that are worth the experience, don't get me wrong, but at the same time it becomes more and more of a joke how much AAA studios seem to somehow be doing too much while at the same time having overly big maps with nothing to do in them. I mean, when was the last time you looked at a Far Cry game or an Assassin's Creed map and went, wow, this game is so big? Sure, that can be exciting, but it doesn't really matter if there's no intent behind it. People joke about how games cost more and more for the customer as well as the developers while not seeming to provide any meaningful reasons for these ballooning costs. And all of this is going on while development times also grow to years longer than previous console generations. This all leads to being a contributing factor of studio closures as well as bloated, expensive games that don't meet the expectations that their insane budgets and timelines require. Infinite growth doesn't seem to be something that is possible while being sustainable within the games industry. So what are you supposed to do then? If you can't stand out by making the most lifelike experience possible anymore, then how else do you do it? Well, I think the answer is pretty simple. After all, indie and AA studios have been standing out for years at this point. I don't want to discount the work of AAA developers because there are some genuine masterpieces that come from bigger studios. I'm not arguing that at all. I mean, look at something like God of War or Ghost of Tsushima. But I think that's kind of the point. Those games are kind of the exception to this rule. They may come from AAA devs, but they weren't trying to be the most realistic thing to hit the market. Sure, they may look visually stunning, but that isn't the same as looking hyper realistic. They have a recognizable world that helps them stand out from the crowd of samey, realistic games. God of War is taking popular mythology and cranking the spectacle up to 11, while Ghost of Tsushima makes almost every moment look like a scene from a samurai movie. This is not hyper-realism, but it is beautiful and focused, which is a completely different thing. I don't know if that 100% makes sense, but it just feels like these games are taking an art-forward approach instead of trying to push everything to its absolute technical limit. Indie games have been doing this for years. These studios tend to have smaller budgets, so they are more focused on making something that can stand out visually. Just look at any memorable smaller game released in the last few years. Most of them look completely different from each other because they're trying to stand out from each other and the AAA games. This is a good thing because everything is smaller in scope, so they can really dial in on what makes that game special. These studios have to work on streamlining their experience and making the game as memorable as possible. This causes us to have smaller games that come out faster and slowly trickle upwards and influence larger games in some cases. That also leaves a lasting impression on us because we're able to get through those games quicker as well. You can do everything you want when you have limitless money, but most of the time a game isn't meant to be an experience where you do everything. A lot of the time that makes for a muddled, confusing mess that no one ends up playing, and I don't think any developer or corporate type within a game studio really wants that. And indie games didn't just decide to do this for no reason. A lot of smaller games that are coming out nowadays are trying to harken back to the 90s and early 2000s era of video games. And while they might be doing that for the sake of nostalgia, they have to follow some tried and true design choices if they're going to truly evoke that feeling of timeless appeal. And when it works, it definitely works. There's a reason that games like Halo, Morrowind, Ratchet & Clank, and Sly Cooper are so beloved even though they aren't the most realistic games you've ever seen. In fact, with the last two, they are willingly going for a more cartoony look. None of these games stand out today in any way when it comes to detail or fidelity, but they stand out in other places where it matters, more immaterial ways. It's harder to easily show these attributes off, but they are just as important to the overall experience as well as the longevity of a game. If done right, games like these are fun years after they originally came out, instead of becoming stale once the newest release hits store shelves. To make up for not looking the most lifelike for the era, these games built upon other aspects of their game. They focused on their writing and storytelling, using dialogue and unique scenarios to make characters and experiences that stick in your mind for years. They innovate their map design and focus on combat until it doesn't matter that these fights might not look real to the naked eye. It doesn't matter because they feel real, and that makes a huge impact on someone. Now, on top of it all, these classic games and others use their technical limitations or time constraints to make a unique visual style instead of reaching for an unattainable reflection of reality. That's what many indie games and AA games are building off of nowadays. Instead of trying to be hyper-realistic, they're going for something no one's ever seen before. And a lot of these classic games of the earlier console generations were better off for it. You can only be wowed by the realest possible games a few times before it starts to get a little old, but there's a lot more to be excited about when you see what a team of developers was able to make with the limitations set by hardware, time, or something self-imposed. So where do we go from here? What does the AAA industry do with this example of the past and the current successes of modern indie games? To put it bluntly, I think AAA bloated, hyper-realistic games aren't going anywhere. For every game that flops after a company pours millions of dollars into it, there's a large enough group of games that succeed beyond anyone's wildest dreams. And honestly, I don't think they should go anywhere. As much as I complain and even use Assassin's Creed earlier in this video as an example of a bloated mess, I think those experiences can also be fun in short bursts. And it does help that they are trying to recreate a historical place. The realism in overcrowded maps sort of works for something like that. It's all about having variety in these experiences. No, those games are probably here to stay. All that I ask is that AAA studios look at the success of smaller games and put some of their eggs into those baskets as well. I mean, if any studio can afford to do it, it's the Ubisofts and EAs and Bethesdas of the world. It's a win-win in my book. That way every release isn't a make or break moment in terms of sales, and they can put out more than one game every 5 years. So that's pretty much all I have to say. Do I want all games to suddenly look as cartoony and angular as possible? Of course not. Variety is the spice of life after all, and there is a place for hyper-realistic graphics in video games. I think the balance has just gotten a little shift. I mean, there's a reason games that look like this continue to sell. They're beautiful works of art in their own right. All I'm trying to say is that a game can be enhanced by going for a distinct look that can make for a better experience overall. These things build on each other. Realism isn't the only avenue to making a game stand out. In fact, as games are able to look more and more like real life, I tend to find myself gravitating towards experiences that look like nothing I've seen before. But what do you guys think about all this? Are you content with games that push the limits of what a console is capable of? Is that what you kind of go to gaming for? Or are you more interested in a game with a distinct art style? I would love to hear your opinions down in the comments. And also, what's a game that stood out to you because it looked different from anything else you'd ever seen before? I don't know, I would just love to hear that too. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.